Mayapple by Elizabeth Twist Hamilton. Read by Dory Legg. Spring equinox before dawn. Sammy wrapped herself in one of the wool blankets from her bed and watched the mellow light hitting the bare branches of the trees that stood behind her mother's house. Black walnut, Manitoba maple. The trees had come through the bad mid-century years when a dozen different plagues arrived all at once. Ash borer, bright fungus, black dust. The human population of the city had also persisted, despite the flu outbreaks of 2075 and 76, tick-borne shadow fever, and the resurgence of tuberculosis. Sammy had been born after, in 2079, when famine dragged its bones across the world, trailing after disease like it had throughout human history. She pulled the blanket around herself more tightly as she listened to the sounds coming from downstairs of her mother loading wood into the kitchen stove. Her father should have been here today for Sammy's ceremony. She closed her eyes as the image came to her unbidden of his body lying in the woods covered with fall leaves, lean, starved, and still. She imagined it. They never learned where he'd finally come to rest. Below her window sat the patchwork quilt of a yard, waiting for the new year of planting. She and the other gardeners had already started to prep the soil of the city for the coming year. In another month, it would be time to plant the earliest of the spring crops. She shivered and plucked her clothes from the chair by her bed. Not yet. Not quite yet. Downstairs, her mother kissed her cheek and made her sit at the table. "It's your day, Sammy. Sit, eat." Sammy held the whole map of the cultivated city in her head. She knew where everything grew and could read the traces of it on her mother's table. Dried nectarines from the orchard that grew on the roof of the shopping mall downtown, cakes made from the ground, fermented corn of last year's harvest, and eggs from the chickens in the yard. To drink, chicory root, gathered from the alley that ran behind the house, roasted and steeped in boiling water. Gil came downstairs when Sammy was halfway through eating. "Sis," he said, his electrician's hands thick with muscle engulfing the mug he held. "Excited for today?" He smiled, eyebrows raised. "Sure." A bubble of anticipation rose in her, delicate and strange. "As you should be," her mother told her, patting her knee. There was no expectation of people like Gil that he would honor his ceremony or that he would tend to the plant that the city elders had given him. 2 years ago, he'd been granted garlic mustard, ubiquitous, nutritious, formerly called an invasive in the days before people found they needed it. It required no caretaking. Just as well, Gil had none to offer. Sammy, on the other hand, was meant to understand plants. She had no idea how she would feel about whatever wild plant she would be assigned. It might be poisonous, useless. She thought again of her father's face, eyes closed, resting, finally resting. The forest hadn't helped him when he needed food. Her mother hurried her along, encouraged her to drink more chicory brew, handed over her boots. Dressed in their coats and hats against the late March cold, they walked to the park east of the house. It was all tall trees, oak and maple that had been there since the old days, some of them hundreds of years old. The forest elders had come in the last 2 decades with pockets full of seeds and roots and filled in the understory with witch hazel, dogwood. They had planted the minor edibles of the woods: trout lily, wild leek, wild garlic, feral apple, black cherry, native plum. None of it was enough to sustain the city. Without the work of the gardeners, the people would starve. Sammy knew that. Still, tradition was important, she supposed. New tradition, forged in the years after life began to stabilize again. They gathered in the cold hush of late morning, 29 people who, like Sammy, had turned 21 this year, their breath ghosting out in front of them in the chill, damp air. The sun rose over the bare tops of the trees as they waited their turn. Polly stood beside her and held her hand, her index finger thick and swollen. She'd been stung yesterday while doing the final winter feeding of the bees, dosing them with a reserve of their own honey and sugar beet juice, reduced into hard brown cakes. One by one they approached the table where the forest elders sat. Polly was called before Sammy and was offered red clover seed. She grinned. It was just right for her and her bees. Sammy stepped forward. An elder dropped 5 brown seeds into her palm. "Do you know this plant?" the elder asked. Sammy shook her head. "Mayapple," he told her. She recalled the school trip she'd taken as a child. Her nerves frayed as she remembered how her father hadn't been very far from home when he died. She remembered the teacher who had taken her hand and showed her a group of umbrella-like leaves gathered at the foot of a black oak. How she crouched to see the white trumpet flowers underneath. On a fall outing, picking the pale yellow fruit, tasting the flesh tentatively after the warning about not eating the seeds or skins. She blinked down at the seeds in her hand and remembered her father. This plant wasn't a crop. It meant something else. Like all the life of the forest, it was food and not food. The pleasure of a single taste, a reconciliation with the losses of the past. She looked out at the park, her eyes finding the tallest of the oaks. She knew just where she would make her planting.